Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm not going to speak about hamsters today, I'm sorry. Thanks for the invitation, Maria, as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a bit of an interloper. I'm not an EU food specialist at all, really. My interest in foods comes from an interest in trying to figure out a methodology to make sense of the spatio-temporal imaginations of legal integration. Which sounds very complicated. It isn't. But food was one of the ways in which I tried, particularly food heritage, was one of the ways in which I tried to make sense of that. So I'll talk you through some of the findings there. Now, I have no presentation, which actually is incredibly convenient because the previous speakers gave me such many things to think about that I decided to do something else than I planned to do. So bear with me if this makes very little sense. In my head, it sort of works. Yesterday on the way over on the train, I was reading a book. It's a Dutch book by Leon de Winter on the Song of Europa. It's not very good, so don't write it down. I wouldn't recommend this necessarily. But the book is set in sort of a dystopic future. So this is mid-40s, 2040s. Lots of things have happened, political upheaval. And the context in which people live in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, the EU is very prominent in this sort of dystopic account, is an account in which the way he brings it, sort of things like food are heavily regulated. So sugar's not allowed anymore, it's just banned. Fat products are banned, meat and fish are banned. There's sort of other alternatives, but you're not allowed to eat it anymore. Pasta and pizza are banned because it's bad for your health. So there's really full-on dystopic picture wherein sort of climate demands and public health demands have changed society at a fundamental level. And this author was quite a sort of proclaimed, sort of well-known Dutch author. He paints this dystopic picture, which takes up sort of 100 pages of the book, basically only by reference to food. So that's enough. It's enough to say pasta and pizza banned for everyone to immediately understand that this is a deeply dystopic future. And so when I was reading that, I thought, yeah, I mean, in all the stuff that we've been discussing today, and all the papers I've read about food regulation and food health and the EU context, what is really missing is this idea of food, the food as being deeply intimate, as being implicated in who we are individually and how we understand ourselves, how we celebrate things sort of regionally, locally, religiously, as our family, the food that our mom made that we love that we can't reproduce for some reason ourselves. All these things are deeply intimate to who we are. And all these things are largely absent from the way we think about EU food regulation. And I would like to use my time to briefly reflect on that and why that is actually a problem when that's missing. And so in my sort of bigger projects, with sort of that hat on, I would say it's problematic because it affects the authority of legal regulation. It affects the authority of EU law when you cannot make sense of how it is experienced by people. How you regulate something, how is that actually experienced by people? Does it bring them joy or does it bring them discomfort? Does it irritate them? Does it lead to rejection of a certain system or a certain vision of society? So I think when we regulate things, we have to be more sensitive to that side, to how it is experienced and how it affects us at an individual and local and collective level. So I've heard a few things in the presentation today about how to do that, how to make this change to sustainable food futures in a sustainable way, in a way that's sort of generally supported and in a way that stabilizes our relations with each other and with the natural world rather than problematize them. So Sabine was mentioning things like, food democracy. And I got a sense that in her presentation, even though I was very convinced by this sort of approach to democracy, the way in which most people talk about food democracy is food democracy as in sort of the sourdough starter, the organic markets, not as a McDonald's. But I mean, to paraphrase a bit on the quote that you put on the board, there's probably also not a democracy without McDonald's. That's also part of the way in which people understand themselves. Societies are stratified, are individualized. McDonald's is also not only choice, heavily mediated by advertisement and additives, etc., but it's also something that says something about who you are and about what the environment you want to live in, not are forced to live in. And then sort of Hannah and a few others are talking about the sustainability as systems thinking. And I think that seems to be the sort of the trend. It seems to be quite in vogue to think about it that way. And I think Natasha from the Commission this morning was also referencing in these kind of terms where they think sort of holistically, it all fits together. There's a logic to the way things interact. I think it also sort of makes sense, but the problem with systems theory, and I don't want to go to Luhmann on panel because she definitely will beat me on that, is that it's very sort of self-referential, it's very immanent. You know, how we measure if we do well is how sustainable it is. So it's sort of blind to the way the sustainability itself is contested. That's not the way we want to reform our food systems. There's other values, there's other things that need to be input in that system. So where does that leave us? So again, my question to Alessandra was a bit in that direction. So is law any good here? How should we think about the role of law in this? Can law actually achieve these things or not? And so my take, I wrote this paper on food heritage, looking at how heritage traditions are changed by the regulation on the EU level. And my take is very close to Alessandra's and Olivier's this morning. It is that the key, I would say, lies in the insulation and protection of lay and local knowledge. It has to be about the articulation and the valorization of forms of understanding law on the local and on the sort of primordial level, on the physical level almost. So it takes us away from this understanding of sort of systems thinking more towards a material and relational engagement with food. So that may sound very complicated. So let me give you a more practical example. So I looked at the way in which the EU law engaged with food heritage, and I use a few examples in my case study. But the starting point is that I realized you can't really make sense of heritage from the perspective of EU law, because EU law is not very sensitive to these temporal and spatial aspects that make heritage so important. You know, that are deeply rooted spatially, deeply rooted in time. Sort of all the claims of heritage are sort of inimical to the way the EU thinks about regulation, which is sort of disembodied, disengaged, totalizing uniformity. That doesn't work when it comes to heritage. So my starting point was not law, but was sort of critical heritage studies. And there, and I'm massively simplifying things, there's two big lessons in that whole sort of field. One is that heritage, claims of heritage, are not about the past. They're about the future. You use the grammar of heritage to say these things of the past matter for our future. These things we want to sustain. And it is an ever-going process of adaptation, reification. Every single tradition you can think about has changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Even though the narrative is this is deeply authentic. This comes from the 12th, 13th century. Yeah, I mean, maybe the idea and the name, these kind of things, but it's ever-changing to ecological changes, social changes, cultural changes, economic changes. All these demands mean that heritage is almost a grammar through which certain practices, local practices, culinary practices are constantly reproduced and slightly altered to fit their actual environments, both geophysical, but also social-cultural. The second lesson in critical heritage studies is that this is a good thing. It's a good thing that traditions and heritage are constantly forced to reinvent themselves and change and adapt to legal regulation, to economic constraints, to climate change. That is what keeps these things alive. That is what keeps the claims of heritage meaningful. The alternative, and that's why law is often seen as a problem in these fields, is where you codify, you stabilize heritage. You say sort of, this is the recipe for Parmigiano, can never change again. That's a problem because you exclude from the engagement with heritage so many actors that have the lay, have the physical knowledge, have the local knowledge, that are able to adapt to changing circumstances. And instead, you create a strong incentive for managerial engagement with heritage. And so in these studies, that's the worst thing you could possibly say is this sort of the worst term is the Disneyfication of heritage. It's sort of Venice. This is what happens when you ossify heritage, when you package it as a product. And when it comes to food regulation, there's lots of ethnographies that have looked at the way in which EU regulation specifically, but also UNESCO, has changed food traditions and food cultures. And they often use this term that it tends to create these museums of production, where you've sort of created this template of what a certain product looks like. And the only way in which people engage with it is by sort of staging this and for sort of outsiders to come and taste it and see how something's made authentically, rather than actually seeing heritage as something that's constantly reappropriated and sort of challenged and mediated by different people within that community. How am I doing?
You are 1 minute away from 5 minutes.
1 minute away from 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's gonna be much better.
Okay, thank you. So let me then zoom in on piece of regulation that most of you will know, EU regulation that most of you will know. This is the geographical protection indication legislation. So this legislation that basically seems at first sight and was intended to protect heritage. You can only sell champagne if it's made in Champagne. You can only sell something as prosciutto di Parma if it was slaughtered and produced and manufactured in Parma, feta, you know all these examples. So if you look at the legislation, if you read the legislation, it is very sensitive to the spatio-temporal relative heritage. It says, for example, you have to define the space where something can be created and not. But that space has to be identified not by reference to a map, basically, but by reference to a particular geo-biological physical environment. So it has to be something unique about a particular space that makes that actually you can only really genuinely produce champagne in regions that have this particular quality. And it's really about down to like hours of sun, hours of shade, types of trees, type of nutrients in the soil. It's deeply specific. It also speaks in the regulation, you can only have these heritage stamps if there has been a transmission between generations of a certain tradition, a certain heritage. But almost all these products have sort of century-long traditions that you can trace throughout historical documents, etc. So on first sight, what this legislation does is that if you have a heritage product and you can prove it, we simply say, look, take it out of competition. No one can compete with you anymore on the markets. It seems like the ideal protection for these things. We give you complete protection on the internal market from competitors. And on average, there's 100% markup of anyone that has gotten this PDI stamp. It is deeply sort of has deep good status on the market. The legislation itself speaks, the purpose of this is to protect heritage, protect local communities whose manufacturing might be more time consuming, more expensive, and we want to protect that from the markets. We want to save heritage because that's what Europe is known for from the markets. So looks good, right? Then you have the reality of this legislation. And there's plenty of ethnographies in Parma, in halloumi, in Cyprus, a few French cheeses. So there's plenty of sort of empirical work done in these areas. And the result is almost everywhere the same. The result is that as soon as you have a consortium that wants to have a PDO, sort of this kind of stamp, certificate of origin, for you to be able to get that, you need a significant level of internal organization. It is as if you're applying for an ERC consolidator grant. That's the level of work and admin that's required. Now, Christina's very good at that. Many of us are. But local farmers might not be. So if they want to do this, they get together, they hire experts, because experts need to write the recipe laws, the history. You read these things and they are sort of travel books. They say, our oil, there's hint of artichoke, and the shade when it goes in the afternoon means that this and this happens to the organoleptic qualities of the olive oil. The amount of work and expertise here is incredible. Then once you have your application, you need to market your PDO. You need to protect it against infringement, both in terms of intellectual property and in terms of markets outside of the EU. You need to create internal homogenization. You need to make sure that all the local producers follow that. So the level of organization required for you to get that is such that the reality in almost all fields has led to internal homogenization, no more experiments within the communities, codification of the rules, it can never change again, massive foreign direct investment. These conglomerates know we need to buy a factory in Parma so that we have this 100% markup. Once they're in, they have all the expertise, they have all the managerialism. They say, you know, I think that we can brand this much better in the US if we add this, slightly this more, because the US market really likes this. And if they want to do it, the rest of the consortium has to do it as well. So in all these studies, except one French cheese where they completely did it another way around, the result has always been the same. When local knowledge is completely frozen out of the process, it becomes this deeply managerialized product. It's a commodity essentially. And what this has resulted in is in deep changes in the local communities, where the intention of the legislation was to protect those communities, protect local knowledge, protect lay knowledge. The result has been exactly the opposite. And so I think there's a good lesson in us for us there. And I'm not saying we should protect heritage and sort of local communities beyond everything else that we've heard today, or the other concerns that we've looked at today. I would just say that if we want to make this transition in a way that is not just ecologically sustainable, but also politically sustainable, I think EU law, all legal systems, really, but EU law specifically, needs to think about where we can locate space for that types of local and lay knowledge. That doesn't require, like in Alessandro's presentation, requires sort of pushing back against law as a system, trying to create space. And it might sound oblique and it might sound difficult to imagine what it is in reality, but these are things like changing the PDO qualifications for ensuring that there's a lot of input by local farmers. It can be making sure that in the adjudication of these cases, in the policy making, in the application, there's sufficient space for exemptions due to local concerns. There are different ways in which you can think about ways for local actors to be engaged in sort of changing the way we engage with food, not from a substantive perspective, not to secure health, not to secure sustainability, not to secure market, feed the world, all these narratives we've heard. All these narratives are based on food as an instrument to achieve something. But food is, as I started, something much more intimate. And if we start from that position, I think we think about food as something that's relational, that connects us. And there's material that is something that is sort of ingested literally. It is something that translates and that gives certain feelings of affect and of emotion. And if that's our starting point, I think we can come a lot closer to creating space for the sort of local and lay knowledge that I think is crucial here. Thank you.
Thanks, Floris. Vladimir, I would like to invite you to proceed. Let me see if I can talk and share a screen at the same time.
So I was wondering whether I can share my screen myself, so that's the people online, they see it as well as Zoom.
Well, that's probably best if I do that, because I can share your presentation on Zoom, people will see it actually. So work, there we are.
Thanks.
Yeah. And you have your clicker with you as well, so this should work. There we are.
Yes, it does.
Just a very brief word about you. You're assistant prof in European private law at the Amsterdam Law School, so you're basically one of us. And your current research is about how structures work relations in food systems, drawing on critical approaches to law. Part of what you will do today.
Yes, great. Thanks so much, Wiebe, for the introduction, and I apologize to everyone for showing up for my own panel only, but I had to teach in the last 4 hours, so sorry for that. So great. Just briefly to say that I'm now sharing kind of preliminary thoughts for a project that hasn't started yet, but is starting in the spring, and it's a very empirical project, and this is kind of sort of the groundwork that has been done until now, but a lot of empirics will happen in the next years. So I'm using basically the opportunity to also gather your thoughts on the preliminary thoughts and on the setup of the study that is starting in the spring only. So, oh yeah, the clicker. Okay, great. So I will proceed mainly in 3 steps in the presentation. I will briefly say on the so I didn't say the title though. So it's Reimagining Labor in Food Production. So it's basically focused on labor in food production and learning from and with Dutch local sustainability practices. And I will first say something about the background of this research and the context. So why do we really need to rethink labor, and why do we need new ways of doing labor in food production? The second part is on the sustainable practices themselves and the visions of sustainable labor that they imply. And finally, I will talk about some expectations and challenges related to the project. As I said, this is a project that is starting in the spring and that will be for 3 years. It's called Towards Just Food Production in the Green Transition, Law and the Making of Sustainable Labor Relations from Below. There are 2 main starting points for this research. So the first one is that, as many have mentioned in their presentations today, that our current food systems thrive on environmental destruction and labor exploitation. And sort of the second part has been more relevant for my earlier work before this project that focused on structures of labor exploitation in the food industry, specifically in agriculture and the meat industry. And the second sort of starting point is that the labor aspect is kind of missing in ongoing discussions on transformation of food systems. I will come back to that in a second. On the worker exploitation in food systems, I don't think that I really have to say much on this. I think sort of exploitative working conditions in food productions are everywhere across food supply chains. Even if we think of the global north, where some labor standards are expected to apply, we have all kinds of labor rights violations across food industrial sectors. Seasonal migrant workers have been one of the most exposed cases regarding worker rights violations in food production, but it's only one of many cases. Even if you think of the final sort of exploitation and violence in the process of food production on the side of workers have been particularly exposed in the years after COVID-19. I mean, the fact that in the middle of the self-isolation rules and ultimate standstill, seasonal migrant workers have been flown in different countries in Europe, says a lot about exploitation violence that is really inherent currently to the food production process. And even if you look at the last report by Michael Fakhri, the right to food, UN expert, or I don't know what's the official title. Special rapporteur, yes, that's it. So the central topic is violence, basically. And it shows in through different examples how violence is underlying the current food production process. So another aspect is, so I'm a legal scholar, so I always, always looking how law has something to do with this. So the idea is that this exploitation that we see in food systems is not only a matter for business practice. So, but there are legal structures that constitute food labor as exploitative labor. And this is starting from migration regimes, which are the most obvious legal construct to look into this, but also most interestingly, subtle contractual arrangements in supply chains, or even land property rights and land ownership, and all this is sort of connected to worker exploitation in food. So this is one of the starting points. And the second one is that in the current ongoing agendas, that some of them were mentioned today, and probably in the panels that I've missed, there have been references to those. But for example, the farm to fork strategy that assumes a systemic approach systemic thinking to food systems. There is little specifically on labor and work conditions in food production, and also in the framework law for sustainable food systems. There are connections to labor. There is mentioning of fair working conditions, or sort of fair trade policies that might imply some sort of labor standards, but there is not a specific topic that's discussed at equal footing with the other sort of targets that these agendas are setting. And one might explain that with the current division of competences within the union, that labor issues are discussed elsewhere, but it's sort of this explanation falls short, because we have seen that labor concerns have been addressed also elsewhere where not specific competences existed. Like recently, the minimum wage directive is one case. So this is the starting point that we seriously need to address this issue of labor in food production. And as a counterpoint to this, and it's actually what the actual project is focused on, is that aside from this industrial level food production that is based on exploitation and environmental destruction, there are ways to produce food that are not sort of driving labor exploitation. So this draws draws on the diverse economist literature that there are beyond the capitalist mainstream sort of food production model. We have other ways of producing food that are represented in different local realities. And sort of the idea in the project is to really look into different practices of sustainable food production that exist in the Netherlands, and to understand how these practices that are not necessarily articulating labor concerns, but are basically establishing alternative sustainable models of producing food. And the idea is to understand how these sort of practices are affecting labor relations. So either, for example, through adopting organizational structures that are based on horizontal distribution of decision-making power that empowers farm workers to some extent. Through these ways are basically challenging established exploitative models of labor relations in food. And I'm specifically interested in sort of food initiatives that are really rooted in cooperation, common initiatives, different cooperative structures, and all this that are, and to understand how they might also change labor relations to this. Like there are many examples, and the study includes around 30 participants from different regions in the Netherlands and different forms of sustainable food production. But just some examples are, for example, community supported agriculture, or CSA, as it's known. And there is a CSA network in the Netherlands, and what it means is that basically food consumers are sponsoring a farm, and then they're getting their agricultural produce from this specific farm while financing the work on the farm, the farmers that are working the land. There have been different points of critique to this model, but ultimately there are positive aspects that have been highlighted from it, in the sense that it creates a different sort of the people involved in sponsoring the farm and the farmers working the land. It creates a different approach to the land by the farmers themselves, but also by the consumers. It creates different types of communities, and which ultimately sort of implies different understanding of work and how that work should be organized on the farm, how that relationship between the people laboring the farm, the people using the food produced on the farm is constituted, is completely different compared to industrial large-scale farming. So there are other initiatives are, for example, Farmers of the Future or Toekomstboeren, which are different kinds of sustainable small-scale farms and farmers that are fostering different solidarity-based collaborations across farmers. One way is they have institutionalized these gatherings around bonfires, sometimes monthly or regularly, where farmers are exchanging knowledge or trying to see how they can collaborate in really solidarity-based ways, which really challenges established competitive relations across farmers. So there are different ways of small scale food production that is basically challenging not only the way how the food is produced, but also how relationship between workers, farmers, and consumers are shaped. And that can maybe offer sort of an alternative pathway, pathway to really rethink labor. So the idea is that project is to, like, I still don't have a definition of sustainable labor and what it should be. So the definition should come through the study. And since most of the people that I've had a conversation with have not articulated, oh, for me, sustainable labor is this, but it is to understand how these different models of laboring in agriculture or in farming sort of rethink farming work. So, and for everyone, it's clear that farm work remains to be a difficult job per se, but there is a big difference between a difficult and exploitative job. And but also then where comes what sustainability should be something more than just like job being bearable and non-exploitative. So that's kind of what definition we're trying to work out through this is at the core of the study, and sort of how I see this and how in the conversations that I've had, many have understanding of labor as a relational concept, not only sort of what do we mean of labor at one specific workplace, but what that labor means, for example, across workplaces, across farms, how working conditions on one place are affecting working conditions on other, and more specifically, sort of, there's a lot of discussion on short supply chains and this and that, but then what we need is also thinking how this sort of, if short supply chains improve the working conditions in one specific local reality, how that affects working conditions somewhere down the sort of supply chain in the global south. What it means that improved working conditions here, what it would mean for producers of the same sort of agricultural goods elsewhere. So this is sort of relational thinking on labor, and sort of as a starting point, of course, we can take basic concepts of labor protection and see how they can feature into a definition of sustainable labor, for example, regulated working time, health and safety, remuneration. The agroecology network had a campaign on fair wages for farmers, social security, these basic things. But ultimately, what many are understanding under sustainable labor is the possibility of workers and small-scale farmers to be involved in the actual decision-making processes, to be able to determine how they produce, under what conditions, for whom they produce, and this is currently not the case. So ultimately, sort of the sustainability of labor will not only come down to just strict working time, but it's a much broader concept, and it is basically the genuinely worker-centered, worker-led, worker-governed food system, where the people actually who are doing the labor have a say on the food production process. As I mentioned earlier, the role of law is really intricate. I will take one more minute to just like finalize this, and apologies for
Shame on you.
yeah. So,
Go for it.
The role of law really in this process is ubiquitous, almost like we have sort of the land ownership arrangement that are currently excluding small scale farmers from access to land. And in the CSA case, for example, the community supported agriculture, it's one of the main reasons that such community initiatives are not materializing to the extent that people would like to see them materialize. There is important work that has been done on land tenures and the effect of this on alternative ways and including labor. So as I said, short contractings, consumer cooperatives, all these kind of aspects are shifting relations. Procurement laws we're mentioning also in the keynote can favor one type of labor over others. And something which is crucial actually, especially in agriculture, is to rethink the seasonality of food work, because the strenuousness of labor and food production comes to the thinking that it's a seasonal activity, which we know it's not. And the idea of seasonality implies that labor can be something that is difficult, and but only because it can be endured by laborers over a short period of time. But that's no longer the case, and this concept will definitely need to be rethinked and reshifted in order to get better understanding what sustainable labor could look like. I will leave this for the discussion, so the expectations and the challenges reflect a lot of the complexity of the law, but baseline is that holistic thinking is needed when we think of rethinking labor in food production. It is less about having one law that will enable labor protection, but it's more about thinking about how the entire legal structure currently, including financialization, the land ownership regimes, contracts between farmers and retail. Someone mentioned supermarkets in the discussion. So all this will be crucial to rethink labor in food production. Thanks.
Can I use the speakers?
You can, absolutely.
Yes,
You have your clicker with you, absolutely. Yeah.
absolutely.
Wonderful, thanks, Vladimir.
Yes, actually,
Arnold, before you get started, very
Yeah.
briefly, Arnold van Valk, emeritus professor of land use planning at Wageningen University, also co-founder of a lot of other things at Food Council MRA, Foundation Voedsel Verbindt, and Foundation Amsterdam Urban Agriculture, and you will discuss the genesis of a regional food policy network.
thank you for your introduction. A brief introduction, because I think it's such a long time ago that I was active as a researcher. I would like to be modest, and I have several good reasons to be, which is almost creating the idea to tell you that you can go and have your coffee or tea that you missed earlier this afternoon, because I'm not qualified in three respects. The first one is that I'm not an expert in law, of course, but I will try at least to make up for that. The second one is that I'm a physical planner, and actually I don't know much about food. And the third reason why you can have your tea or coffee is because my wife told me before I went here that I should not hide from you that when 6 years ago I was retired, I could not even bake my own egg. So many reasons not to take me too seriously. I invite you to come with me for a quick hike through Amsterdam, and I will share some observations with you, not more. That's all I can do, I'm afraid. But let me start with today's theme, at least that I can do. Let's see if I can find the right pointer. Yes,
I can do that.
So, no, sorry, now we do it both. I would like to relate to the today's theme, and much to my surprise, when I went to Berlin 2 weeks ago to have conversations with my colleagues over there, who are also amateurs, and trying to set up a food policy network in the city of Berlin, which is quite similar actually to the Netherlands. We all complained, because that's what we do after a beer, we all complained about the lack of funding. And then some of these colleagues in Berlin tell me, haven't you read the IPES report, the report that Oliver de Schutter produced? That the EU will provide solutions to your problems. And since I have always been known as a Eurosceptic, they used a lot of persuasion and a lot of beers to make me change my mind, and this was actually what they told me. And they said, well, you should read that report, you with your skeptic ideas. I mean, the European Union is your ally, maybe the only one you have, because in the municipality some of the politicians pretend to be sympathetic, but judging by the funds that you have, there's still a lot of work to do there. So EU, that is, I was really surprised, I can tell you. Well, now I will take you for a few observations. So when I was retired, for one reason or another, I decided to focus my attention on establishing food policy network, for the reasons that Sabine, I think, explained excellently well. I, as a citizen, want to gain more power over my own food environment, and want to cooperate with like-minded people to at least to get rid of some of the worst practices in the whole food system. And things I will immediately and also had to get to grips to it. I thought that we, because I'm a planner, we need food planning. And these are concrete reasons why we need food planning in the region of Amsterdam. And much to my surprise, a lot of people were convinced. So we started out 7 years ago, we started out with a nice conference with lots of beers again to build or to lay the foundations of a food policy council. And some key elements play a role, and we've heard it all along in many of the presentations today, these elements, much to my surprise. So a lot of these phenomena that you lawyers study on the European level also appear on the national level, appear on the regional level, even on the local level. So that's where I start. But we all started from the idea of that we need to perceive our food environment as a food system, defined by us here in Amsterdam as a complex of elements and activities that come together in these well-known episodes of the food cycle. And why do we do it? Because we are after food democracy. Ordinary people like us getting together and we want to get to grips with this food situation because there's so much wrong. Oliver de Schutter told us only that much of the whole story. It's an absolutely vital element, of course, our food, our daily food. So that's why we started this food council for the Metropolitan region of Amsterdam. By the way, for those of you who want to know more, I have provided some materials which includes annual reports, etc. And then you can see what it actually is, because here, of course, I can only touch upon some elements. But it must be familiar by now that there are similarities in what is happening on the European level of our food system and what is happening on the local level. One of the, and that's where the legal aspect comes in even in my story. After 4 or 5 years pioneering, we found out that we need a legal status, because otherwise you can be in business with municipalities for subsidies or with corporations for projects and events. And what is even more important, these legal the legal aspects are immediately related to knowledge, all kinds of knowledge. Much to my surprise, when I started this citizen initiative, I immediately was more or less forced to have more contacts with academics than I had during my life as a professor. And what is happening now over the 6 or 7 years that we are active as an informal food policy council is that there is much, sometimes to my surprise, there's a network emerging of particularly people, individuals who are active in some, and you get to know this person. And you know, if I'm trying to start up this or that project, I need to have this person. And the network at the moment exists for, say, 10 years. initially 5 years intensively. And these are the contours of Amsterdam. Some of you asked me with coffee, what kind of organizations are you associated with? These ones. And at the bottom, Europe comes in. So we all suffer from scarce funding. And much to our surprise, after 4 or 5 years of intensive deliberations and preparing proposals, we were so lucky as to have our Food Council is a key partner of an EU Horizon program called FoodClick, and there are 2 more European programs involved at the moment at the food transition in Amsterdam. Yes, no problem whatsoever. Yes, and one last observation that I would like to share with you is that this Food Council for the Metropolitan region is a platform of stakeholders. And it started out quite successful, I must say. We did it during an international conference, Flows of Foods, in 2017. And for one reason or another, time was ripe for it. There were 350 attendants. The province of North Holland was the funder. The municipality of Amsterdam was an enthusiastic fan of what was happening. Every very important person in food business was there. So we thought that, okay, it's done. It's that simple. So now we are going to develop a whole civic empire for food. Well, nothing of this happened. That's a complicated story, but it's put on paper. So for those of you who want to get into detail, I can recommend reading the paper. But what actually happened, the result, and that is very relevant, I think, for today, and may reflect also developments on the European level, is that actually there is one network, but there are 2 cores in the network, and that happened for many reasons. One is that our Food Council is still at the heart of citizen initiatives, what was also called alternative food networks. And on the other hand, there is the status quo, the organization that represents the agro-industrial complex. And the interesting thing is that since 2017, these are no longer only opposed to each other, but there are all kinds of interesting threads developing between these, what used to be separate worlds of food. And that is the domain where I'm pioneering at the moment with the Food Council. And this is where I leave my case.
So 2 minutes remain. Yeah. So thanks so much. Yeah. That's where, yeah, okay, we'll go there, so over there, perfect. So our final speaker for this panel is Hens Runhaar, who is Associate Professor of Governance of Nature and Biodiversity at Utrecht University and Visiting Professor at Reimagining. What I find fascinating is, aside from your academic expertise, you're also deeply involved in a variety of NGOs. And mostly we're involved around the practice of nature conservation and landscape restoration. My favorite one is the Badger Protection Association, Utrecht and Gooi. We probably won't talk about that, but I thought that was my favorite of the extracurricular activities. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So I will keep it short a bit. There's a lot of sun. I wanted to stand up here. Yeah. Me being the last in a row in a long day, can imagine that you're longing for drinks. But let me briefly say something about what's happening in the Netherlands in terms of more sustainable agriculture. And then I would like to reflect with you on what the implications are for EU law. So I want to turn it around. I think that was also the title of this panel, something with bottom up. So yeah, first of all, very briefly, what is nature inclusive dairy farming? I will focus on dairy farming and why would we need it? Then the second subject is what are the challenges, what are the struggles for dairy farmers to become more nature inclusive? And then, yeah, I would like to have some input from you. What role for EU law and policy? Because I know quite a lot about the national and the regional and local policies, but not that much about EU policies. So I hope to learn from you. So nature inclusive agriculture is really a Dutch policy term. Internationally, it's basically known as agroecology. It means farming with and for nature. But of course, in Netherlands, we wanted to have our own concept, so that's nature inclusive, which was introduced in 2014 in a policy document by the Dutch government. And it basically consists of 3 pillars. One is make use of ecosystem services. I think Elizabeth already gave a very good introduction, so I will keep that short. But making use of natural processes, particularly healthy soils, rather than relying on artificial inputs, fertilizer, agrochemicals. Reduce environmental impacts and make a positive contribution to biodiversity. Which is not always functional. And you can see the bird on the top right. And I always ask them, do you know this bird? So who knows the name of this bird? Pluto, indeed. Yeah, it's our national bird, right? In the north of Amsterdam, there's also quite a population, but it's also an iconic species in terms of the rapid decline, or the ongoing decline of biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. So this is basically nature inclusive agriculture. And for dairy farming, it can look like this. So we made a distinction between different types of measures that farmers can take in order to become more nature inclusive. Some measures relate to just the basic quality of the grasslands. You can think of using manure rather than chemical fertilizer. Herbrage, permanent grasslands, so not grasslands that are plowed every 7 years or so, but permanent, sustainable, healthy soils, and having grazing rather than keeping cows in stable. These are all management practices that can have a positive contribution to biodiversity. Then farmers can take species-oriented measures that are not directly of benefit to the farmers. Think of raising water tables, well, and especially north of Amsterdam, south in the peatfen areas. This is also really necessary because we have to deal with soil subsidence because of drainage of the grasslands in order to manage the land. But it has led to quite some problems in terms of infrastructure damage, but also methane emissions. So it can have multiple benefits except for the farmer. You can think about measures to protect birds and more extensive forms of farming. So that basically means fewer cows per hectare. And you can imagine not per se of added value to the farmer, but of benefit for biodiversity. And then there's integration. There are measures that basically, at least in theory, would imply win-win for farmers and nature. Enhancing soil organic matter. I think that was also what Elizabeth explained. So all kinds of agroecological practices that can have both benefit for the farming practice and for nature. But why do we need it? Well, I guess you all live here in the Netherlands, so you know what the nitrogen crisis means. Yeah, it's quite evident that It's not only a decline in biodiversity in the agricultural landscapes, which is well, visible, for instance, when you look at typical meadowbirds, and I have this graph just as an example, but particularly also outside agricultural landscapes. Farming has quite a strong impact. So nitrogen is one example. The other one is water quality. So we've been in a nitrogen crisis for 4.5 years yet, and I can say that nothing happens. But well, what happened is that we have a ban on building activity, so it's made extremely difficult. And in 4 years' time, it's going to be even more difficult because then we have a water quality crisis. So there's really a need to transform farming practices, but that's not easy. Yeah, well, this is well, let's keep it a bit optimistic. These are the results of a study that we conducted a few years ago, commissioned by the Ministry of Agriculture. I had a talk with Michel. He's in the back and he will be in the panel. That if you're not from Wageningen, then it's extremely difficult to get money for research on sustainable agriculture. But we got a little bit of money, and for that we did this study to identify the key structural barriers of farmers to transform to more nature-inclusive dairy farming. It was published last year, so Dorrit Vermunt, Nico Waitinia, they are shared first authors. They were PhD students working in this project, which I led with a lot of colleagues. So I will briefly just discuss, but if you're interested, I have the references at the end of the presentation. So the first main barrier is that for farmers who engage in more nature-inclusive forms of dairy farming, basically there's a lack of payments. In theory, nature-inclusive agriculture has benefits to farmers, which I just showed, but if you have more extensive practices, it will mean a loss. If you postpone mowing because you want to protect meadowbirds, it means yields go down. So there are all kinds of costs involved or benefits foregone if you switch to more nature-inclusive agriculture. And there's a lack of payments for this. We have agri-environment schemes, agrarische tehuur here, but that only applies to 5% of the landscape, agricultural landscape. So it's not sufficient to pay all farmers. Because of EU competition law, the payments cannot exceed the cost incurred or the income foregone. So it's not profitable. It's not. I mean, yeah, it is attractive for farmers because you can diversify income, but you cannot make a decent living. Most of the dairy is exported. I think Arnold showed that 95% of the food in the metropolitan area of Amsterdam is exported. Well, dairy is about 70–80%, but well, I mean, Dutch consumers are not willing to pay premium. Well, German, Belgian consumers are even less. So there's really no market basically. But there's also not an equal or level playing field. Maybe there's also a linkage with European law. I think we had a discussion already about true cost through pricing. Dairy farmers who negatively contribute to biodiversity, they're not taxed for this, they're not penalized, whereas if you positively contribute, you make costs, and that makes an uneven playing field. Second is that many farmers have high debts. So the average price of a hectare of grassland is about €65,000 per hectare, which is extremely costly. Many farms have invested heavily in stables, in technologies, so it's a very capital-intensive sector. Then switching to more extensive forms of farming is something that banks normally don't appreciate, but it also comes with uncertainties, with risks, so it's very difficult to transition. If you don't own land, but you rent land, often this is based on short-term contracts, which does not give an incentive to invest in your soil, in your land. So that was the second. And I think this one also was discussed today. There are problems in terms of knowledge transfer. So we have a liberalized agricultural regime. In the past, there was independent advice to farmers paid by public money. But nowadays farmers are advised by commercial parties who don't necessarily have an interest in low input, lower output, agroecology, nature inclusive agriculture. So that's a problem. 5 minutes. And it's also, I mean, if you work in the conventional way, you can control environmental conditions. You lower the water tables, you have ryegrass, you have fertilizer, and you can just manage your lands. But if you switch to nature inclusive, then it's much more dependent on soil types, on the regional conditions. It's more complex. So you need more knowledge, more experimenting, and that's more difficult. This is a very important barrier, the lack of perspective. As you all know, if you follow the debate a bit, I mean, it's extremely difficult, apparently, for regime actors, including the Ministry of Agriculture, to provide long-term certainty about what's expected from the agricultural sector. 2 ministers now already failed to produce such a vision, together with what the vested interest, so to say. Landbouwakkoord also was a big failure. In my view, that's we could have expected. I mean, if you, it's like debating with the turkey what to eat with Christmas, right? It's the same. I mean, if you talk with actors that have interest in the status quo, whereas you want to have a transition, these are two things that do not get together well. Policy making is extremely siloed. It's also something that was discussed today. That also does not really come together in an integrated view, and this is highly problematic. And then fifth barrier, I mean, all the barriers are interrelated, but there's quite some resistance to change within the sector, which of course also has to do with a lack of perspective, a lack of business models, etc. But also there's a lack of figureheads, of nature inclusive farmers who can really show that this is the way to go, that this is more attractive than conventional farming. So there's a lot of resistance to overcome. And that basically are 5 key problems. So my invitation to you would be to think about not so much what are the causes, because of course competition law, that's one of the causes, but mainly how could EU law and policy help overcome these barriers, which I don't think are specific for the Netherlands, but may also help to transition towards more nature inclusive agriculture. And I want to end with the lab wing, the keep it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for this very open invitation to see how you law, instead of being part of the problem, can maybe be part of the solution. See if that's possible. What we'll do is we open up the floor for basically it's the same format really. So we take questions, we gather 3 of them, and we response. See one in the back. Yeah, so Giacomo, Santa Maria.
I guess my question is for Hans, but also for Floris. And then I have another question just for Floris. So for Hans and Floris, so there is this narrative which is in popular debate is very strong, that the traditional or delay, what would you call delay, it's where sort of a lot of the maybe